Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program on Edward Duffield with Bob Frishman. We welcome everyone who is here in the room with us here in Worcester, and those of you who are attending virtually on YouTube as we live stream the program this evening. We are coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs here. Our mission as a national research library is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in our growing collections of primary sources that have been collected here since 1812. We foster a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and generous support of scholarship. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world, around the country, and from right here in Worcester, to use our collections, both physical collections and digital ones, we host programs like this one tonight to provide insights into the past and its resonance for today. As a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep our work going, and we thank you. You can learn more about the AAS collections and our programs on our website, which is at americanantiquarian.org. Tonight's program is being recorded, and you can watch recordings of this program and any of our programs on our YouTube channel, which you can find via our website. For those of you who are in the room with us, we ask that you please silence your devices so that we avoid any potential distraction. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Bob Frishman was introduced to horology, the science and art of measuring time, back in 1980, when he was invited to the overflowing basement of a collector and dealer of antique clocks, watches, tools, and machinery. Since then, he has repaired 8,000 mechanical clocks, restored and sold 2,000 antique clocks and watches, published more than 100 articles and reviews, delivered as many lectures, and curated exhibitions at the Horological Society of New York, the Museum of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, NAWCC, and the Willard House and Clock Museum. And I'm pleased to say that the director of that museum and president of the board are with us here this evening. Frishman is a Silver Star Fellow of the NAWCC and a liveryman of London's Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. He operates Bell-Time Clocks in Andover, Massachusetts, where he lives with his wife, Jean Shinto, author, and they were both elected to AAS membership in 2023. This evening, Bob will be presenting on his new book, Edward Duffield, Philadelphia Clockmaker, Citizen, Gentleman, 1730 to 1803, which is published by the American Philosophical Society Press in August of 2024. So you are getting a first look at a book before it is officially out this week, I guess. So please join me in welcoming Bob to the podium.
Thank you, Nan. And in case you need to know what the logo is of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, this is it here. So if you want to appear at my jacket later, I won't think you're trying to steal my wallet. So great, thank you for that introduction, Nan. I greatly appreciate being invited to speak here about my new book. As Nan mentioned, I became an AAS member just last year, so I'm especially grateful and honored to be at this podium. I also have to thank my good friend Ed Kane, who was invited tonight, but he'd rather be sailing, and I don't blame him. But he generously underwrote the production of this book. I donated my time and effort to the project, but Ed has funded all its other costs, and all the proceeds from the book sale go to the American Philosophical Society, APS. You can keep this in mind if you buy the book now or later on Amazon. More about my book, including links to reviews and interviews that have already happened, is at www.edwardduffield.com. That should be easy enough to remember. This talk tonight will not be a reading, but rather an introduction and a companion to my book. You'll see a large selection of images from the hundreds that I've collected during my research, and I'll be showing them quickly as we go along. If you'd like to look longer at any of them, please contact me, or you can watch a recording of this presentation. So in 1952, the year I was born, the June issue of the magazine Antiques had a clock on its cover. Better yet, inside was a quote by its longtime editor, Alice Winchester. Her words eloquently summarize my book's themes. And I'll quote from this, and it's probably the last time I'll read from the screen because I don't like that, but in this case, the theme is so perfect for me. She wrote, "Collectors of antiques are likely to think of clocks as furniture rather than as timekeepers. They pay considerable attention to the case, but little or none to the mysterious mechanism within, though that is actually the clock, and in most cases the only part of the whole thing made by the man whose name appears on the dial. Cases were made by cabinet makers, dials were usually imported, and the product of the clockmaker was the hidden work. It's these complex devices that concern the true clock collector, and the story of their development and the growth of the clockmaking industry in America is a fascinating one indeed." So I say amen, and actually I could sit down at this point, but I'll give you some details about Edward Duffield and his world. So let's see, I'm flipping my pages too fast here. So my biography of Edward Duffield is the story of a highly skilled 18th century Philadelphia clockmaker, but it's much more than that. We all know that his city and the years that he lived were among the most important in the history of colonial America and of the early United States. Highly relevant is that the APS, my book's publisher, Edward was elected to its membership in 1768, along with many other luminaries of his day. Benjamin Franklin founded the APS in 1743. It's America's first learned society. Its members are scholars, scientists, and professionals who represent extraordinary accomplishments in all fields. So I'm really proud that my book bears the APS imprint. So a year after Edward's election, the APS commissioned him. Oh, here's some the other members during that period when he was elected to APS membership. So a year after Edward's election, the APS commissioned him to make a high-accuracy regulator clock for timing a rare transit of the planet Mercury across the face of the sun. This was just a short time after the more famous and highly anticipated transit of Venus that was observed worldwide. You see that clock still in the APS collection. This is the first of several full pages that I'm showing from the catalog section of my book. There we go. And this is the clock's fine movement, crafted by Edward in just 3 weeks. We see Edward's city in 1754. The pink shaded area is the central location of Edward's home and shop at the corner of Mulberry, later renamed Arch, and 2nd Streets. But Edward was not a typical leather apron colonial artisan. He was an affluent 18th century urban craftsman who was deeply involved in the economic, civic, and religious life of Philadelphia. Our mechanic was born wealthy. His grandfather Benjamin arrived from England in 1778 at the time of Philadelphia's founding. This was 4 years before William Penn himself stepped off his ship, the Welcome, and saw his new colony for the first time. Benjamin, although not a Quaker, was among the crowd greeting Penn. He became a wealthy tanner, builder, and landowner. He left most of his property to his grandson Edward, who had somehow survived a tragedy, perhaps smallpox, that swiftly killed his mother and 4 brothers during 10 terrible days when Edward was just 6 years old. He was raised by his grandfather, father, 2 sisters, and a stepmother, but he served no known apprenticeship. Other young men needed to. You see a 1741 indenture of Emmanuel Rouse, who was apprenticed to the famous Philadelphia clockmaker Philip Stretch. You'll hear more about these 2 men. As an adult artisan, Edward rarely advertised his wares or services, and he was a member of the city's social elite. He was entrusted to sign local paper currency, each one requiring 3 original signatures. The 15-shilling bill was issued in 1769 for relief and employment of the poor. I continue to search for one of these bills with Edward's signature. I know that they've existed, but I haven't found one yet. Probably in the file over in the shelves here, right? So take a look afterwards. He served on boards, public boards, commissions, and grand juries. He was a member, vestryman, and warden of the city's most important Anglican place of worship, Christ Church, along with many of the city's most prominent non-Quaker leaders. The church remains a historic landmark today. Throughout his life, Edward owned and paid substantial taxes on many holdings, including land, horses, coaches, rental housing, and small numbers of enslaved workers. This is his city assessment in 1767, placing him in the upper percentile of personal wealth, and it does not include the many properties of his outside of the city. Benjamin Franklin, then in England, nominated Edward, along with Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, to oversee Philadelphia's Bray School for African American children. Another Bray School was in Virginia, and its rediscovered building is now being restored at Colonial Williamsburg. In a letter to the Bray Associates, one of only 2 letters we know of by Edward, he reported on the school students. These are his words to the Bray Associates. There are at present 2 at their needles and spelling, 1 at knitting, needle, and testament, 7 at spelling, 3 in the testament, 1 in the psalter, 10 in the alphabet, 1 in fables, 3 in the primer. 3 of the above children are free, and the rest of them are slaves. Clockmaker Edward worked in a highly prestigious trade for a quarter century before our War of Independence. He provided costly clocks, watches, instruments, and horological services to the city's prosperous citizens and institutions. But unlike many of his fellow artisans, he had no financial pressures to endure long hours at arduous tasks, nor was he critically impacted by economic disruptions. He could study, he could work, and he could engage in many unpaid activities without the fear of poverty. 45 years old in 1775, he retired from horology and moved 10 miles north to live and farm on his large estate, Benfield, named after his grandfather. This is the only known photo of Benfield that was demolished in 1898. Perhaps he was like his leather apron friends, printer Ben Franklin and cabinet maker Jonathan Gosselow. Each gave up manual labor when they'd reached their 40s. For Edward, there was the lure of healthier, quieter life in his country estate. His wife, Catherine, may also have had something to say about it. Perhaps he was tired of horology's many challenges, but other realities for Edward were just as likely. There was escalating conflict with Britain, affected both the market for his services and the availability of English supplies. There were growing numbers of competitors. John Dupuy in 1770 was nearly next door to Edward on the same street, and Dupuy paid extra to draw attention to his newspaper ads with a clock face. After Edward's move, tax records listed him as a farmer, not a clockmaker. 1793 document identified him as the late clock and watchmaker. The vocation was not inscribed 10 years later on his gravestone, and we'll see that later. And yet Edward produced some of the finest floor-standing clocks in 18th century North America. Several of them are prominently exhibited at world-class institutions, and they're illustrated on the 60 pages of my book's catalog. This is the Duffield at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, purchased to honor the retirement of longtime Americana curator Morrison Heckscher. You see Maury here speaking in 2016 at the symposium I organized at Winterthur about their clock collection. The Baltimore Museum of Art has one. One was donated in 1946 to the AAS neighbor just down the street, the Worcester Art Museum. And you see the little head there? That clock was gifted by Judge John M. Woolsey. His 1933 ruling is famous for allowing James Joyce's Ulysses to enter the country. So Winterthur and Colonial Williamsburg have them, and so does the Library Company of Philadelphia. I hold Library Company share number 8, issued originally in 1731 to a son of clockmaker Peter Stretch, Joseph, who was in another line of work, hat making. That's about as close as I could get. So, other Duffield clocks in elegant mahogany and walnut cases stand in house museums, historical societies, and private collections. I visited many of these during my 5 years of research and writing. This Duffield oversees a conference room at Columbia University. I examined it with my friend, Manhattan clockmaker John Metcalf. Although Edward never advertised as an engraver, he produced dies for the first 2 commemorative medals issued in colonial Pennsylvania. The first was an Indian Peace Medal, and I have a replica of one in my pocket, which I would be happy to show you afterwards. Both of these medals were created in 1757 and struck by local silversmiths. The first, this one, was an Indian Peace Medal commissioned by Quakers to encourage peaceful relations with Native Americans. Chiefs displayed these medals on their chests, as we see in this portrait by Henry Inman. Ironically, and sadly, the second medal was ordered by city leaders to celebrate the malicious destruction of a Native American village at Katanning near Pittsburgh. A monument still celebrates this military victory led by Colonel John Armstrong, who was wounded during the battle. Edward was an expert in building and design, perhaps learned from his grandfather's many ventures in real estate development. Edward inherited and owned many homes and buildings. He oversaw the construction of Philadelphia's innovative new Walnut Street jail. In a twist of fate, however, he was briefly incarcerated in that jail during the British occupation of Philadelphia. Dragoons had forayed out of the city and captured him, along with several others in the countryside outside of the military perimeters. Thomas Paine sent a letter to Franklin about that incident. The author of Common Sense also reported on a stay he made at Benfield with Duffield and about the loss of Franklin's furniture during the months when his Philadelphia home was occupied by redcoats. So later in the 18th century, Edward designed his estate's two-story stone barn that became a model for many others in Pennsylvania. His barn has been gone for nearly a century, but a similar one from the same era remains at Stenton, the former mansion of city leader James Logan. But except for these buildings and the clocks and the instruments bearing his name, they're just shadows, footprints in the sand about the life of Edward Duffield. Intensive research now and in the past unearthed only a handful of primary materials. We have no diaries, no ledgers, no account books, nothing like this watchmaker account book that I was happy to examine here at the AAS after I was alerted to it by your curator, Ashley Cataldo. I'd hoped she was going to be here, but she's playing with rare books somewhere else today, right? So I hope maybe she's watching or she'll watch the recording of this. So we know nothing of Edward's upbringing. We know nothing of his education and training or why he chose horology. There were no clockmakers in Edward's family or his ancestry in the English village of Duffield in Derbyshire. Neither of his grown sons followed in his footsteps. Benjamin became a respected physician, bravely caring for the sick and dying during Philadelphia's tragic yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s. Thousands of residents perished at that time, including many clockmakers. Edward's second son, Edward Jr., was a gentleman farmer who never married. His portrait on ivory, this is a miniature, painted in 1790 by James Peale, was sold at an antique show shortly before I began this project. So I don't have it. But I'm sad, too, that I've discovered no formal portraits, miniature or large, of Edward or his wife. He certainly could have afforded them. Perhaps they exist somewhere, staring from a descendant's living room wall or hanging unidentified in some private or public collection. So we need to look around here, too, Nan, for that. So how did Edward become a clockmaker, like this elegant fellow pictured in 1748? I can propose a reasonable scenario. Given his family's affluence, he was not going to be bound to apprenticeship under a demanding master. For general education, he probably was privately tutored, as was William Franklin, Benjamin's illegitimate son, who was born just 2 months before Edward. There were tutors advertising and teaching, as we see in this 1743 notice when Edward was 13 years old and maybe tinkering already. He may have been drawn to horology through intellectual curiosity, inspired by Ben Franklin's wide-ranging interests. Fortunately for us, Franklin did not make him a printer. During past centuries, a passion for horology has captured many people, young and old, including Henry Ford, King George III, and tens of thousands of members of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. I got the bug in 1980. We've all been enchanted by lifelike machines with ticking heartbeats, shining faces, and gesturing hands. Edward reached adulthood in 1751, and he married earlier than most could afford to at that time. He began as a food merchant at the home he inherited and then occupied for the next 24 years. In just 2 lines of print between notices for ship arrivals and Rhode Island cheese, he advertised anchovies, olives, lemons, and capers. He placed the same ad for the next 2 weeks, but he dropped the capers, so maybe they sold out. The next year, 1752, he was one of the first to sign and place his red wax seal on the subscription for Franklin's new fire insurance company, the Philadelphia Contribution Ship for the insurance of houses from loss of fire, the first of its kind. Insured buildings mounted this logo plate on a street-facing wall. I guess the ones without the plate, they let them burn down, right? So Edward later became one of the Contribution Ship's long-serving directors. Still in business today, it maintains digital archives that provide online scans of surveys of insured properties going all the way back to the beginning. Edward's boyhood home, later sold by his family to the widow Cunningham, was documented with its 17-foot frontage and 37 feet of depth. His own home, 2 adjoining houses, was surveyed by local architect and builder Joseph Fox. Thanks to these old yellow papers, we can picture Edward's domiciles inside and out. In 1800, artist William Birch published his colored prints of Philadelphia. None of them show Edward's homes, but 2 are very close. Down this view of 2nd Street, at my red line, you see on the right, was Edward's corner. In this view, the artist was standing with his sketchbook on Arch Street, just up from 2nd, perhaps right by Edward's door. So it's giving you a sense of the streets and the neighborhoods that Edward walked and lived in. When Edward first moved to that busy corner, he may already have been working on timepieces and instruments. He could have been learning from locals, like Peter Stretch and his son Thomas, who lived just steps away. They're the subjects of this fine book by my friends Don Fenimore and Frank Holman. But not until 5 years later, at age 26, was he first publicly identified as a watchmaker. And in this ad, he was simply informing the public that he'd confiscated a stolen silver spoon. He probably had no need to advertise. He had ready access to the city's upper crust, who knew him from his family's civic and church connections. Another 6 years passed until, at age 32 in 1762, he was named to the prestigious position of maintaining the public clock in the Pennsylvania State House, now called Independence Hall. Edward took over from the clock's maker, Thomas Stretch, whose machine drove the clock dials at each end of the building with long shafts connected to the centrally mounted movement. As we see, the dial at one end of the building was in the form of an oversized grandfather clock. It's still there, although the building's main clock has been in the tower since the early 1800s. Thomas Stretch's big machine is now gone, but this photo shows a similar iron movement that was in the tower of a church in Newburyport. A Massachusetts friend bought this at auction some years ago and invited me to take some pictures of it in his garage. So just because of this form, this is really most likely a lot like what the Thomas Stretch movement looked like from the mid-1700s. So Edward maintained the city's public clock for 13 years. And of course, if he messed up, the whole city knew it. So probably a high-stress position. And then he passed the job to his more famous Philadelphia colleague, David Rittenhouse. Another recent Fenimore Holman book focuses on this famous Philadelphian. At the risk of me imposing contemporary hindsight, or presentism it's called, I can speculate that Edward's path may in some ways echo my own road to horology. At age 28 in 1980, yes, that's me, while working as a speechwriter and press secretary for Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, I was introduced to horology by a chance meeting. My hobby grew until it blossomed a dozen years later into a full-time profession. Like Edward, I was mentored but not apprenticed. Mostly on my own, I studied, practiced, broke things, eventually had antique clocks ticking reliably on my workbench. However, Edward got proficient at clockmaking. We're glad that he did. And we can be sure that for Edward, as for most horologists then and now, repairing and selling, not making, consumed most of his days. This is one of the very few receipts we have in his own handwriting, charging Joseph Shippen, an important merchant, in 1767 for a new best silver watch. Many upper-class homes in Philadelphia, like the 1765 Powell House, had valuable clocks standing in hallways and on landings. These and other luxury goods often were British imports that were considered superior to local products. Many of the gentlemen and ladies who lived in those comfortable homes carried silver or gold watches. For Edward, cleanings and repairs would have provided much steadier work than an occasional order for a new clock. Even if more of Edward's clocks are documented in the future, his sales of new ones could have been no more than 2 to 5 clocks per year, hardly enough to keep him busy. Regarding Edward's other substantial sources of income, we know quite a lot from public records about his lands, buildings, possessions. We know about the public and church bodies on which he served and about the charities that he actively supported. He was a manager of a lottery in 1767. Yes, government-sponsored lotteries were big fundraisers back then, too. And this one promised large prizes and only a 15% take for the sponsors. We know the births, marriages, occupations, and deaths in his family, but we have only the vaguest hints about Edward himself. No descriptions of his height, weight, hair color, demeanor, or voice. One more. There it is. We do know what he wore. Let's go back, because I hit that twice. Based on ledger pages kept by his upscale tailor. Joseph Graysbury's account book listed 99 articles of clothing purchased between 1765 and 1773 for Edward, his 2 sons, and his Negro man. Some of his outfits might have looked like what John Cadwallader was wearing in a 1772 family portrait by Charles Wilson Peale. We may know what young Edward looked like. In 1921, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston purchased a portrait attributed to Swedish-born Pennsylvania artist Gustavus Hazelius. It was inscribed as a likeness of Edward Duffield. Art experts later rejected the Hazelius attribution. Then they questioned the sitter's identity because the name was written on the wooden stretcher, not on the back of the canvas. The afternoon that I learned about this portrait, I was ready to rush to the museum. Oddly enough, I'd been at the MFA that very morning. Then came the bad news. Portrait had been deaccessioned in 1986. I placed advertisements seeking its whereabouts, but I've had no replies. Is it here? Come on, Dan. The painting had been in the collection of Edward Duffield Ingram, a grandson of our Edward. He was a Philadelphia lawyer, notorious as one of the official enforcers of the Fugitive Slave Act. He sent many escapees back to bondage. His death in 1854 was widely celebrated by abolitionists. So I probably shouldn't talk a lot about his descendants. The painting's next owner was Eli Holden, a prominent Philadelphia watchmaker who doubtless appreciated a portrait of a well-known predecessor. The portrait then came to Boston via a dealer and Eli Holden's heirs. Edward may be the subject of an old drawing shared with me by one of his descendants who may be watching tonight. If so, thank you. Family lore claims that this is Edward. The drawing accompanied an incomplete Duffield movement that the family owned. Edward's watch papers, perhaps printed by Franklin, were pressed into the backs of pocket watches to repel dust and to remind watch owners about who sold and serviced their timekeepers. Many watchmakers use these, and the AAS has a wonderful collection of more than 600 of them. On the little paper disc, he stated that there was a dial sign at his shop's location. One of the stories most often told about Edward is that he made a large, unique, 2-sided clock to hang outside of his shop. Supposedly, Franklin suggested it so that Edward would not be constantly bothered by visitors entering the shop to ask the time of day. However, I can find no contemporary reports about this outdoor timepiece, as I would expect, given its prominence and uniqueness. The anecdotes about it appeared in print only decades later. Perhaps it was the more typical painted sign that tells the right time of day just twice a day. Only 2 letters are known that were written directly to Edward. Neither was from his friend Ben Franklin, who we know was a great letter writer. One letter was written in 1765 by Minister and Colonial Secretary Richard Peters, who warmly expressed his great affection for Edward. Peters was a leader of the Philadelphia's Anglican congregations, and he was considered the most learned man in the colony. In his letter written from England, Peters wrote to Edward that, "You have distinguished me in so friendly and open a manner that I owe you everything that love can do where it meets love." The second letter to Edward, more businesslike and with no mention of love, was from Franklin's sister Jane Meekham. She wrote to Edward after her brother's death in 1790. Many period newspaper advertisements are reproduced or transcribed in my book to demonstrate the offerings and growing numbers of Edward's local competitors. A thick modern reference book lists about 150 Philadelphia watchmakers and clockmakers active during Edward's time. This roster of all recorded Philadelphia horologists covers nearly 9 pages. I collected relevant newspaper ads from soon after Edward's birth in 1730. In 1736, Francis Richardson offered very good clocks and some mechanical roasting jacks that turned meat on a spit. When Edward was just 17, Elias Boudinot advertised clockmaking and watch repair by Emmanuel Rouse, whose apprenticeship with Peter Stretch I mentioned previously. The next year, when Edward was selling capers, Benjamin Bagnell Jr. had arrived from Boston, moving away from his more famous clockmaking father. He offered clocks with cases and without. In 1756, when Edward first called himself a watchmaker in an ad, Henry Flower was right there on 2nd Street, also with a dial trade sign. Appealing to the richest customers who preferred English-made goods, William Ball in 1760 advertised London watches and clocks with the maker's true name on them. Yes, there were fakes back then too. Lawrence Ashe, late from Mr. Duffield's, provides the one hint that Edward employed an apprentice or journeyman in his shop. John Lind took over Edward's shop at Arch and 2nd Streets in 1775 when Edward moved to Benfield. As we see, this German immigrant, who Americanized his name from Johannes, was seeking an apprentice. My book is not just Edward's story. It explores the nature of colonial clockmaking and watchmaking in the 18th century. At least a half century before Edward's maturity, the craft based in England, France, and Switzerland already relied on divisions of labor to produce finished and unfinished components. This truly was the beginning of a globalized production and trade in manufactured goods, so familiar to us today. Dozens of specialized craftsmen were employed in fashioning clock and watch parts. Few American or European makers were making clocks solely by themselves from raw brass or steel. Even fewer of them had the ability or the tools or the desire to make watches from scratch. Edward had easy access to local and imported horological goods that were much easier to buy than to make. In 1752, when Edward was just starting out, this local brass founder offered work in the rough for clockmakers. We see fellow clockmaker and merchant John Wood selling parts in 1771, and Timothy Barrett doing the same thing 2 years later, a few steps from Edward's shop. These parts were equal in quality to parts Edward would otherwise have needed to laboriously cast, cut, turn, scrape, file, and drill by tedious hard labor. At this point, I should acknowledge the groundbreaking work of my longtime friend Robert Cheney, who's here with us this evening. This is where you start to blush, Robert, right? So, okay, all right. More than 2 decades ago, his article in the magazine Antiques documented these divisions of labor and the English origins of clock movements and the parts that supposedly were made, but more likely assembled and finished here in America. Edward's clock movements, like the one that I show here that I restored, differed in no significant ways from those by other colonial and British artisans. Small dissimilarities among Edward's movements, when he would more reasonably have made them exactly the same from his own templates, can suggest multiple sources, as Robert Cheney so clearly illustrated in clocks signed by Willard family clockmakers. In my book, I discuss and illustrate Edward's movements and compare them to others. This is that same movement disassembled, and in my book there's a key to these numbers that names these parts. Each is a standard English style and quite possibly of English origins. I own an English tall clock signed by Joseph Harding of London. It dates to around 1760 when Edward was in the business too. I compared that movement's components to one of Edward's, and they are quite alike. I've serviced and studied hundreds of similar English and American tall clock movements during the past 40 years. Here's my photo of the Duffield and Harding escape wheels. Harding's has my Sharpie's red dot. The wheels are basically the same. There's one outlier that may be Edward's earliest known clock. It is mechanically simpler than his 8-day versions, and its daily wind, one-hand movement, and dial look like the old-fashioned timekeepers that still were common in his day. The unusual boxy case was restored about 20 years ago with that folky paint job. Older auction photos of the clock show a case of bare pine. George Eckhart, in his classic Pennsylvania Clocks and Clockmakers book, reminded us that clockmakers using outsourced parts was only a start of the process. What these men bought was far indeed from a finished clock, and even though a clockmaker could buy parts, his resourcefulness was often taxed. So Edward was likely to have assembled and finished clocks from rough prefabricated components, but this implies no denigration of his horological skills. Those tasks required substantial expertise, experience, and specialized tools of the trade. But producing an entire movement from raw materials during Edward's years was decidedly old-fashioned and obsolete in major urban settings. His standard composite brass dials are indistinguishable from dials or faces that were fit to other makers' movements. English-made dials were easily purchased and were quite difficult to fabricate without different and specialized training and equipment. We here can compare a Duffield dial with others from the period that were signed by colonial and British makers. Edward almost certainly engraved, his name on those dials. The ornate signatures mostly are identical. I do document 4 very unusual Duffield dials. These have spherical lunar indicators. This rare feature is found on a small number of earlier English clocks, such as a 1720 London clock by Joseph Williamson. But Edward's system for rotating the metal globes was different and simpler. He adapted standard dials to his design to offer a unique upgrade. I know of no other early American clocks with these black and silver lunar balls. Like nearly all watchmakers then and now, the title signified a repairer of watches. Very few colonial watchmakers could craft a multitude of tiny parts and create a functional watch, nor would there be any reason for them to do so. Only top-level watchmakers like Daniel Quare, whose beauty we see here, had the necessary skills and rich customers, but even much of their work was contracted out. Colonial watchmakers mostly sold and serviced English-made watches, like this one circa 1761, with the owner's name, which you can probably figure out is Samuel Morris, on its personalized dial rather than the numbers. Colonial watchmakers sometimes engraved their own names on the back plates of the imported movements. Edward probably did this on watches identified as his in 2 published notices of missing watches. This ad could indicate that Edward signed at least 12 such watches. We've yet to find one of his, however. That would be great. Again, I'll consult Nan here afterwards. So Alice Winchester reminded us at the start of my talk that Edward did not make his clocks elegant wooden cases. Had Edward ever written an autobiography, it definitely would not have been a book about Philadelphia case making or Philadelphia furniture making. In Edward's time, the word clock usually signified only the movement and dial. In inventories, the case was named separately, clock and case, and ordered separately by the purchaser. Edward probably collaborated in decisions about the cases. He needed to make sure that the machine would fit properly within them. He may have discussed with the customers and cabinet makers the choices of woods and the levels of quality and ornamentation. But again, the bulk of his time he spent repairing, not making, also in no way lessens our respect for Edward's expertise. As I can attest, after 4 decades of bench work, there's nothing easy or routine about repairing intricate mechanical devices. We can see, that's a picture of the case. Now we can see here the reason why a recent repair job of mine quickly got complicated. A gear tooth had snapped off, and the adjacent tooth is bent and ready to break too. Even today, a movement overhaul can be plagued by malfunctions, errors, accidents, defective parts, lengthy troubleshooting, and the dreaded comebacks days or months later. I always hated to answer the phone after I delivered a clock. Edward had even more severe repair challenges: bad lighting, minimal magnification, long supply chains, poor lubricants, and greater variations in metal supplies and parts. Many of Philadelphia's watershed 18th century events are discussed in my book, not only for context, but because Edward almost certainly witnessed or directly participated in them. The Paxton Boys crisis in 1764 was diffused in Germantown, near Philadelphia. Franklin and other leaders, perhaps including Edward, convinced a mob of Pennsylvania frontiersmen not to invade Philadelphia to press their demands for more protection against French and Indian incursions. Edward probably witnessed the local militia nervously mustered 2 blocks from his home. Parliament's repeal of the Stamp Act was celebrated with bonfires, barrels of beer, State House banquet for 300 people, and an outdoor feast for another 430 residents. Edward probably ate and drank with the crowd. In 1774, we know that he was on a committee of local mechanics who were planning responses to Britain's closure of the port of Boston following the Tea Party. His name, however, does not appear again on committees, unlike David Rittenhouse, who later was vice president of the local committee of safety. David issued this urgent alarm about the approach of General Howe's British Army. Long after the Revolution, when Edward was a prosperous farmer, he contributed his expertise to a 1797 publication about fertilizer. In a question and answer format, he described his successful use of plaster of Paris to improve his crop yields. Also known as gypsum, this chemical remains in common use today to stimulate plant growth. My book's final chapter, preceding the catalog, discusses Edward's close connections with Benjamin Franklin, 24 years his senior. Edward's boyhood home was next door to the family of Franklin's wife, Deborah Reed. This drawing, mounted for today's visitors on the wall of Franklin Court in Philadelphia, shows their adjacent dwellings in 1723. They shared a wall, actually. This historic map of Old Philadelphia, published by the APS in 1952, shows the location of those next-door neighbors, the blue square about in the center. Edward's later home was a short northerly walk away, the blue and red square just up from it. In the early 1750s, when Franklin's shop also served as a local post office, he and Deborah recorded 9 transactions with Edward. These appeared in a new APS database built from the shop's ledgers. In the days when the receiver, not the sender, was charged for the postage, young Edward paid for mail arriving from New York and Boston. I wish that we could know what he got and from who, but at least we can picture him striding up to the counter to ask the Franklins for his packages. Edward's mother-in-law, Mary Parry Smith, was for 50 years a close friend of Deborah Franklin. Sally Franklin, the daughter of Benjamin and Deborah, noted this in a letter to her father when Mary Parry Smith passed away. Sally and her family stayed at Benfield for extended periods, and she wrote of her strongest attachment to them in another letter, and also indicating that they had spent time out there at Benfield. This is Sally, some years later in 1793, Ken Franklin's daughter. Edward's sister married Ebenezer Kinnersley. He was Franklin's close collaborator on their famous experiments with electricity, and Kinnersley lectured extensively on the subject throughout the colonies. Some suggest that Edward perhaps sat in on those experiments and helped build the instruments. Kinnersley was also an important faculty member at the Philadelphia Academy that Franklin was instrumental in founding. Franklin himself often sent warm regards to the Duffields in his letters from overseas. You see mention of George Washington here too. He sent seeds to Edward, and we know that he visited the London shop of the famous longitude clockmaker John Harrison. In 1767, in a letter to his wife, he enclosed a Harrison book for Edward, our ingenious friend. We see a portrait of Harrison painted that very same year as the letter. Edward expressed his thanks for the book, but again via Deborah. I'm sorry we have no written words directly between the two friends on this historic subject. After Franklin returned to America from his long stay in England, where he finally despaired of reconciliation with the mother country, the first draft of the Declaration of Independence was discussed at Edward's estate. Franklin was recovering there from a gout attack in June of 1776. Jefferson and Adams traveled to Benfield for the meeting. Edward, no doubt, was there too, and he probably did more than just pour the Madeira. Franklin designed the first continental currency, the Fugio dollar. He urged citizens to mind your business and get to work battling the British and building a new nation. Fugio is Latin for it, time, flies. He used a sundial motif, reinforcing his point of no idleness while the sun shone. Edward produced this sundial dated 1757. As required for accuracy, he calibrated it for his city's latitude, 40 degrees north of the equator. He may have used this highly detailed engraved instrument to regulate clocks and watches. Sundials were the most reliable timekeepers of the day. Although Edward was described in this 1960 George Eckhart article as Franklin's clockmaker, an Englishman, John Whitehurst, better deserves that title. He was an eminent horologist who Franklin visited several times in Derby. Whitehurst crafted prototypes of the three-wheel clock that Franklin designed in an attempt to make simpler and cheaper clocks. As we can guess, the confusing dial limited its appeal. I don't know what time it is now. Duffield clocks descended in Franklin's family, but there's no records of Franklin ever purchasing one. The makers of clocks are not identified in Franklin's estate inventory, as clocks rarely were in those documents. David Rittenhouse, as you see, was one of the appraisers of Franklin's possessions. Most often noted about Edward is him being one of the three executors of Franklin's will. This is definitive evidence of their long friendship and mutual trust. In a codicil to that will, Edward was gifted Franklin's French Waywiser. These early odometers recorded miles traveled. This instrument probably is the one that Franklin attached to a carriage wheel during his long-distance postal inspections on the eastern seaboard. It has registered about 1,600 miles. Before I close, I should say how excited I was to discover some original Duffield ephemera right here at the AAS. This 1801 almanac clearly belonged to Edward. He signed his name on the cover, and he made notes on blank pages about barrow making that he'd contracted. These men's names appear elsewhere, too, as his tenants. I've seen no other papers with so much of his handwriting. Another reason for me to love the AAS. Edward died July 12, 1803, age 73. I'm sad that I could find no published death notices, obituaries, or eulogies. He's buried in the graveyard of All Saints Episcopal Church in the Torresdale area of Philadelphia. He worshiped there later in life near the Benfield estate. His table-style tomb is at the center, marked with my red cross. I took this photo when I paid my respects. His wife, 2 daughters, and 1 son, Edward Jr., are resting with him. Other descendants are there too, including 2 cousins who later fought on opposite sides in the Civil War. The broken columns you see there mark those graves. In September, I'll be speaking about my book at All Saints, as well as at historic Christ Church, where I can point to where Edward and his family sat and worshipped. I and my listeners will be sharing the same sacred spaces that Edward did nearly 3 centuries ago. Fortunately, we need not be sitting in those sites to feel Edward's presence. We can commune with his clocks in museums and historical societies. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If we're even more fortunate, we have a Duffield clock. This is my Duffield. I'm its trustee until somebody new in the future can cherish it. You see a past owner, Mary Williams Brinton, in that small photo up top. Her house on Delancey Place in Philadelphia now is the Rosenbach Museum and Library. The Rosenbach book dealers live next door to her. In her privately printed 1972 autobiography, Their Lives and Mine, she wrote of this family clock that was purchased by her grandfather in 1878 and she wrote, "A great intangible masculinity clings to grandfather clocks, usually good timepieces. The old ones have untiring energy and keep ticking something of the past life of a former generation. Such a one is in our upstairs sitting room." This clock now stands in my Andover home. I think about Edward and about how lucky I've been to learn so much about his life when I wind his clock every Sunday, when I hear its constant, steady ticking as I write this talk, and when I lift my head each hour to hear the ringing of his bell. And now, my thanks to the AAS and all of you for attending. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We have some time for questions, and so we can take questions from those of you in the room here and also on YouTube from the back. So if you do have a question, just wait until I can get the microphone to you. Otherwise, our YouTube audience can't hear.
Do I get to say next question if I don't like this one?
I have a question that's maybe a little off topic. I met and got to talk to Barry Marcus, who's a watch repairman, and he started when he was 14 years old and repaired a lot of the people who fought in World War II's watches. They'd been given watches when they went into the service, and then he would repair them and fix them up for free when they came back. But his thing was he would never repair clocks. In his whole life, he repaired 2 clocks, and other than that, he wanted to restrict himself to watches. Do you know what went behind that kind of logic, since you said you did both?
Yeah. Well, I started out playing with watches too, and then I said, this is way too hard, and these things are way too small. So I think there's very few people that want to do both. It's almost a separate trade, and it's really because of the scale that you need sort of separate abilities to work on tiny stuff in watches as opposed to bigger clocks. So it's I think it's a question of preference too, and of course, no watch weighs 380 pounds like some clock might too. But I think really there's few people that do both, except, cocky young guys like me that at the beginning said I can fix anything. But I learned pretty soon in the hard way. I opened up my first watch that I'd gotten from my father, said, oh, this is interesting, and violated rule number 1, let the mainspring power down. So when I took that last screw out, about half of the watch ended up in our shag rug, never to be found again. Thanks for the question.
What about the cases? In Philadelphia, a lot of the clocks have similar style of cases. Do we know anything about the makers?
Almost entirely it's attribution and guesswork, where clearly the owners of important Philadelphia case clocks want to say that this was made by Gosselot or this was carved by Juguiers or by Bernard. But, none of those things were signed. Some things you say, this is probably his, and if it is probably his, then this one that looks just like it is probably his. But, it's guesswork. Thank God that, clockmakers usually weren't shy about slapping their name on something. But furniture makers, it simply wasn't done, except, we find if we're lucky, the guy, wrote in chalk on the back of a drawer or something his name. So it's very hard to tell. I mean, it's clear that these are Philadelphia cases and they're beautiful. But, I guess because I'm not a furniture guy, I don't get hung up by, who made it. I mean, they're beautiful, they're period. They make his clocks look great. So, I like them, but it's difficult. And I think until we invent a time machine and watch, Juguier making those carvings, we're not going to know. And in most cases, I don't know why we care, really. They made beautiful cases, and let's just admire them for what they are, not possibly who made them, because we can't be sure.
But no evidence of his working with any of these case makers.
You could assume, as I say in my book, that Jonathan Gosselot did work with him because Gosselot married his a cousin of his. It was claimed it was his niece, but it wasn't. But it was somebody. And she also came with a lot of money because she inherited some of Benjamin's money too. And unfortunately, she died a couple of years after she married Gosselow. But then, he was a rich widower, and he was kind of in that elevated, affluent artisan society like Duffield was. But it kind of makes sense. They were near each other. They were kind of related. So, it would make sense that he was one of the clockmakers. He made the beautiful baptismal urn, I think, or the dais in the Christ Church, where I'll be in September. So, he's a known maker, and I think there are furniture pieces strongly associated with him. And perhaps there are cases, too, that you could make a good case for the case. Well, where'd that come from? Yeah.
At one point in your talk, you mentioned the lubricant in the clock. What kind of oil did they use?
You sure you want to know?
Maybe it's whale oil?
Yes, or blackfish, which were porpoises or dolphins. There's gruesome pictures still because a lot of that oil making industry took place on Cape Cod. There's still a building in Provincetown that says it was an oil refinery. And you see pictures of 40 dead porpoises on the beach, and they're harvesting the oil that came from their jaws, I think. So, and that one of the problems was that those are organic materials that deteriorate and rot. And often those old oils, if you open them up, it's an overpowering, horrible smell. But after a while, not only do they smell bad, they're not oil anymore. They turn into something else, sludge and smelly sludge. So, so that, now synthetic oils and all, they'll last until they get, too full of dirt. But back then, again, mostly sperm oil or dolphin head oil, because they were pure and, they were good for temperature, because a lot of, issues with oils is that they could thicken up in the cold and all. So if this whale or dolphin's been swimming around in 40-degree Atlantic Ocean waters, maybe that oil stays oil, even in low temperatures. Some of that was true, by the way. So, yes.
So I was wondering, a lot of the clockmakers also came from a background of carpentry, master craftsmen with the John Harrison background. And, the community I come from are also craftspeople, and a number of them are watchmakers. And therefore the notion that the cabinet and the watch is made often by people who share a similar level of artisanal skills. And the children of these craftsmen are still makers of instruments, the Large Hadron Collider, the CMS experiment that found the Higgs boson, is led by exactly people who came from this instrument making, watchmaking community. So when I thought of coming to the talk, I thought, without reading your book, that his story is going to be like John Harrison's story, that he was a carpenter who had skills to make complex instruments, that is the genealogy and the lineage through which clockmakers come from. And indeed, if you read about Swiss clockmakers too, they also carry very high level of craft skill. Because remember, the John Harrison story was that he was a craftsman as opposed to the Royal
Yes.
the Royal Society, oh God, I forgot the details, who were supported by the king, and therefore he was rejected, the story that Dava Sobel tells.
Yes.
So I'm very curious about, you sort of said that you were not interested in the cabinet, but the cabinet making was as skillful in lots of ways as the complexity of the instrument itself. Therefore, I was wondering how many of these clockmakers were actually children of artisans and craft people.
I think it certainly was in the gene pool, that they wanted to work with their hands. But it reminds me too that, in all modesty, I say that, back then, and of course now too, the smartest, the best craftsmen were horologists, the ones that made the clocks and watches. But I think it was certainly very true in the 16th, 17th, 18th century that sort of the most skilled artisans sort of led the Industrial Revolution and led the advancement of mechanical arts for sure. A lot of the machinists and craftsmen that built the textile industry and then the armaments industry and all, a lot of them were clockmakers and watchmakers first. But I think there's certainly a difference between building things out of wood, that are furniture, that essentially don't do anything, except my bias, as opposed to a machine. If something is slightly wrong with the clock case that nobody can see, it's still going to hold the clock up. But if something is slightly wrong with the clock, it doesn't work at all. So there's machinery as opposed to woodworking that's different. And I think there were very few examples of people that did both, that made things out of wood and made things out of metal. The craft is very different, but I accept your thesis that they were all smart people that have led where we are today, so we're not running around in bearskins anymore. So, thank you. Have I worn them out, Nan?
Okay, one more.
What are the mathematical instruments?
Mm-hmm.
There was a mention that Duffield made mathematical instruments. Do you know what they were?
Surveying compasses. Yes, my book at the end, I think, has 9 examples of surveying compasses that also have his name on them. And he was an engraver, so there's no reason to think he didn't make them. But again, it's one of those things where they look an awful lot like surveying compasses coming from people that made those both in England and America. So it's unclear about that. But there certainly are beautiful instruments, beautifully photographed in my book, that have his name on them and are considered his instruments. There are records in the American Philosophical Society of him repairing and making surveying instruments. And he was paid for them. So I think that's pretty good proof that he wasn't just engraving his name on somebody else's instruments. I don't know of any other instruments he made, but again, some suggest that he was there as a teenager with Kinnersley and Franklin, helping to make some of those electricity experiment things that they played with and amazed crowds with. I don't know if he made the thing that electrocuted the turkey or not, but he might have witnessed that. Mm-hmm.
Well, before we offer one last round of applause for Bob, I want to note that there are books out here. If you'd like to have Bob sign a copy, there are books for sale. And also the almanac that Bob showed is on view in the case in the reading room. So on your way out, you might take a look at that in the case, along with the copy and in the book where it is illustrated. And I just want to also let everyone know that our next public program will be happening in September. And that is on September 19th. It is a hybrid program. Again, will be both in here and on YouTube. And that is a talk by Alex Berenger on lost literacies, his new book, Experiments with the 19th century U.S. comic strips. So that should be a really fun presentation. So come back in September. Bob, thank you so very much.
Okay.